My name is Maya. I'm 33 years old. I own 11 locations of a fast casual Mediterranean restaurant chain across 3 states, and 4 months ago, my aunt forged my signature on a document that would have handed my entire company to a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 12 years. I want to take you to the exact moment I found out, but first you need to understand how a woman who raised me after my parents died ended up sitting across a conference table from me with a forensic accountant between us instead of a birthday cake. Picture this: a law office in downtown Denver, March 3rd, 2026, 3:15 in the afternoon. My Aunt Carol sitting very still while a forensic document examiner explains, in careful, technical language, exactly why the signature on a shareholder transfer agreement wasn't mine. That's where the story ends. Let me show you how we got there. If you're watching, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment, and stories like this one land differently depending on what you've lived through yourself. My parents died in a car accident in 2009 when I was 16. My mother's older sister, Carol, took me in without hesitation, and for the first 2 years, she was exactly the person I needed. Patient, steady, present at every school event. My own grief made it hard for me to fully show up to myself. Carol had one son, my cousin Dominic, 3 years older than me, who treated me, in those early years, like an actual sibling rather than an obligation. I want to be honest about that because this story isn't as simple as a villain and a victim from the very first scene. Carol earned my trust for a long time before she ever spent it. The shift happened slowly, the way most family betrayals do, not in a single dramatic year, but across a decade of small recalibrations. My parents had left me a modest inheritance, not much, about $80,000, along with a small strip mall property they'd owned outright in Aurora. Carol managed that inheritance as my legal guardian until I turned 18. And by the time I gained control of it myself, in 2011, there was $61,000 left, a shortfall Carol explained as the cost of raising a teenager. An explanation I accepted at the time because I had no framework yet for questioning the only family I had left. I used what remained, plus student loans and 3 years of restaurant work, to put myself through business school at the University of Colorado. I opened my first restaurant, a small 12-table Mediterranean spot called Olive and Ash, in 2016 at 23 years old, funded by a combination of savings, a small business loan, and $15,000 Carol lent me personally. A loan I paid back in full within 18 months, with interest she hadn't even asked for, because even then, some part of me still wanted to prove myself worthy of the family she'd given me. Dominic, meanwhile, drifted through his 20s the way some cousins in stories like this always seem to. 2 years at a community college he didn't finish, a series of sales jobs that never lasted past the first commission dip, 3 separate investment opportunities Carol quietly funded and never mentioned to me directly, though I pieced them together later from bank records during discovery. By 2020, Olive and Ash had grown to 4 locations. By 2023, 8. By early 2026, 11 spread across Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico, with a projected annual revenue north of $14 million and a franchise licensing deal I'd just begun negotiating with a private equity group that valued the whole operation at roughly $22 million. Carol's tone toward me had been shifting for about 2 years by then, in ways I noticed but kept excusing. Comments about how some people get lucky with timing. A pointed remark at Thanksgiving 2024 about how Dominic never got the same kind of head start I did, as if the head start in question hadn't been 11 years of 80-hour weeks and a decade of student debt I was still paying off. I let those comments slide. The way you let things slide with the only family you have left, telling myself gratitude required a certain amount of tolerance for pettiness. The binary choice moment came in September 2025. Dominic, 39 by then, approached me directly asking for a $200,000 investment in a franchise consulting firm he wanted to start, pitching himself, essentially, as an unpaid advisor to my own company, a role nobody had asked him to fill, and a role I had no reason to believe he was qualified for. I said no. Carefully. Kindly, the way you decline a family member without wanting to detonate the relationship over it. Carol called me 2 days later, her voice cooler than I'd heard it in years, and said, "I raised you like my own daughter, Maya, and I've never once asked you for anything in return. I'm asking now. I told her I loved her, and I still said no. She didn't speak to me for 6 weeks after that call, the longest stretch of silence between us since my parents died. If you've ever had the one family member who raised you turn a business decision into a referendum on your gratitude, you already know exactly the kind of pressure I'm describing. Tell me in the comments if that's familiar. The silence broke in November 2025 when Carol called to apologize, her voice warm again, inviting me to a family dinner, no strings attached. I went cautiously, and the evening passed pleasantly enough. Dominic barely mentioned business at all. Carol asked genuine-sounding questions about the franchise deal, and I left that night with the specific, uneasy feeling of a person who has just watched a familiar door reopen slightly faster than it should have, given how firmly it had just been shut. What I didn't know until February 2026 was that 3 weeks after that dinner, Carol had visited the private equity group's outside counsel, presenting herself, according to their intake notes, as my family financial advisor, requesting a copy of the shareholder structure documents for the franchise deal on the grounds that she needed to coordinate estate planning on my behalf. The firm reasonably declined to release anything without my direct authorization, but the request itself, once I learned of it, told me everything I needed to know about what Carol had actually been doing in the 6 weeks she wasn't speaking to me. The discovery came from an unlikely place, a paralegal at my own transactional attorney's office who mentioned, in an unrelated call about the franchise closing timeline, that the amended shareholder transfer had already been notarized and was sitting in the closing file, awaiting only my final signature to be recorded. I had signed no amended shareholder transfer. I had authorized no transfer of any kind involving anyone other than myself and the private equity group. I asked the paralegal to send it to me immediately, and I sat at my kitchen table that evening reading a document that listed Dominic Alvarez as a 15% equity holder in Olive and Ash Holdings LLC, with a signature at the bottom that looked, at a casual glance, almost exactly like my own. Almost. I've signed enough legal documents in the last decade to know my own signature the way I know my own handwriting on a birthday card. And the loop on the Y in Maya was wrong, too tight, too rushed, the kind of detail a forger gets close enough to pass a glance, but never close enough to survive real scrutiny. I called my attorney, a woman named Renata Castillo, the next morning, and within a week she'd retained a certified forensic document examiner named Howard Lynn, who confirmed, after comparing the signature against 11 verified samples from contracts I'd signed over the previous 2 years, that the signature on the shareholder transfer document was, with a documented confidence level Howard, described as close to certain as this field allows, not authored by me. Someone forged your signature on a document transferring 15% of a $22 million company, Renata told me over the phone, her voice carefully neutral in the way lawyers get when they're about to say something they know will hurt. We need to figure out who notarized it, because whoever that was either participated knowingly or was deceived just as badly as you were. The notary, it turned out, was a woman named Patricia Osei, operating out of a UPS store in Aurora, who confirmed, once Renata's investigator reached her, that she had notarized the document based on a driver's license presented to her that she now believed, looking back, may have been altered. The photo matched, she said, but something about the document itself in hindsight had felt rushed. She hadn't kept a copy of the ID for her own records, a lapse that would matter enormously in what came next. But she did remember, clearly, that the woman who'd brought the document in for notarization had introduced herself as Maya's aunt, handling this on her behalf since she's traveling. A detail that placed Carol, unmistakably, at the center of the forgery. If you've ever discovered that someone who raised you was capable of forging your name on a legal document, you understand the very specific kind of grief that isn't about anger at all, at least not at first. It's about mourning a version of a person you'd spent your whole life believing existed. Drop a comment if you've ever felt that particular kind of loss. I didn't confront Carol immediately. Renata advised patience, the same way I'd later learned from a friend in a similar situation. Most good attorneys advise patience in cases like this. Gather everything first, because confrontation without complete evidence only gives the other side time to construct a defense. Over the following 6 weeks, Renata's investigator built a full timeline. Bank records showing Carol had paid Patricia Osei's notary fee in cash the same week the document was created. Phone records placing a call from Carol to Dominic 11 minutes before the notarization appointment. And most damning of all, a text message thread recovered from Dominic's own cloud backup, subpoenaed once probable cause existed, in which Carol wrote on January 14th, 2026, "I already have the paperwork. Drafted. We just need her signature or something close enough. Once the PE deal closes, you'll have real equity nobody can take back, and I finally won't have spent 30 years raising someone else's daughter for nothing." Someone else's daughter. 11 years of birthdays, school plays, a decade of gratitude I genuinely felt reduced, in her own private words, to an investment she believed she was finally entitled to collect on. I read that message sitting in Renata's office, and I want to tell you I cried immediately. But what actually happened first was stillness, the exact stillness I imagine surgeons feel the moment before they make the first incision on a case they already know is more serious than the family in the waiting room has been told. I cried later, that night, alone in my car in my own driveway, for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. We scheduled the meeting for March 3rd, 2026 at Renata's office, framed to Carol as a conversation about estate planning documents that needed her signature to finalize. A small, deliberate irony I allowed myself, given everything. Carol arrived at 3 p.m., wearing the same cream cardigan she'd worn to nearly every important family occasion for as long as I could remember, and sat down across from Renata, Howard Lynn, and me without any visible suspicion at all. Howard began by walking through the signature analysis, methodically, the loop on the why, the pressure inconsistencies, the timing gaps that don't occur in a natural signing motion. Carol's face stayed composed for the first 2 minutes, the same composure she deployed at every family dinner where a hard truth needed smoothing over. It cracked when Renata placed the recovered text message on the table between us. Someone else's daughter, printed in plain black text, undeniable. "I want you to understand something," Carol said finally, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it, all the practiced warmth gone from it entirely. "I gave up things for you that I never told you about. A promotion I turned down in 2010 because it would have meant relocating and uprooting you again after everything you'd already lost. A relationship I ended in 2013 because he didn't want children in the house full time. I told myself for years that all of that entitled me to something eventually, and somewhere along the way I convinced myself forging one signature on one document was a small enough price for 30 years of sacrifice nobody ever thanked me for. For one brief moment, sitting across that table, I saw not the woman who'd forged my name, but a person genuinely exhausted by a decade of quiet resentment she'd never once said out loud until the exact moment it stopped being deniable. "I did thank you," I said, and my voice, to my own surprise, didn't shake. "For years. I paid back every loan you ever gave me with interest you didn't ask for. I named you as my emergency contact on every medical form I've filled out since I was 18. Gratitude was never the problem here, Carol. Forging my name on a legal document to hand, my company to a man who's never worked a single day for it, that's the problem. And no amount of sacrifice from 2010 makes that acceptable in 2026. Dominic, who had said almost nothing through the entire meeting, finally spoke. "I told her this was insane," he said quietly, mostly to the table. "I told her back in January when she first showed me the draft. I should have called you the second she mentioned it instead of just going along with it, because it was easier than saying no to her. It wasn't a full apology, and I didn't accept it as one that day, but it was, I noted, the first entirely honest sentence Dominic had said to me in over a decade." Renata laid out the options plainly. The forged document, already discovered before it could be recorded or acted upon, gave us grounds to pursue criminal forgery charges, a civil suit for attempted conversion of company assets, or a negotiated resolution that avoided both, provided Carol signed a full, notarized retraction, reimbursed the legal costs of the investigation, and agreed, in writing, to have no further involvement in any Olive and Ash Holdings business matters, ever. Carol signed it that same afternoon, her hands, I noticed, shaking slightly for the first time since she'd walked in. The private equity deal closed 6 weeks later on Olive and Ash's original, unaltered ownership structure, at a final valuation of $23.4 million. Dominic, in the months since, has called me twice, both times without asking for anything, once just to ask how a specific location was doing, a location he'd actually visited in person, on his own, without me knowing, which told me more than the phone call itself did. Carol and I haven't spoken since that meeting. I sent her a card on her birthday in April. Brief. Honest. Leaving the door open without pretending the last decade of quiet resentment simply disappears because a document got retracted. She hasn't responded yet. I'm not waiting for her to. I think if you've made it this far with me, the thing worth remembering is this. Gratitude is not a debt someone else gets to collect on their own terms whenever they decide the balance is finally due. You are allowed to be thankful for someone and still refuse to hand them something they were never entitled to. And when someone forges the truth to get what they believe they've earned, the calmest, most devastating thing you can do is simply lay the real truth down next to it and let the two speak for themselves. If this story meant something to you, subscribe, drop a like, and tell me where you're watching from. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. I'll see you in the next one.